The first thing that went wrong that morning was the sprinkler line. Not my fault, technically, but when you're the one standing in somebody's backyard holding a shovel at 7 a.m., fault stops mattering pretty fast. I had been hired through a landscaping company I did contract work for. Mostly maintenance, irrigation repairs, the kind of outdoor jobs that need someone who can read a system and actually fix it instead of just quoting 3 weeks out. The call came in 2 days before. Property in the hills above Malibu. Owner was private. The note from dispatch said, "Bring your own lunch, park at the lower gate. Don't ring the main house unless someone tells you to." I knew whose property it was before I got there. Margot Ellison. You'd know her from tech news, not entertainment. She'd built a software company in her late 20s. Sold it at 34 for something in the 9 figures, and then mostly disappeared from public view. The kind of money that stops needing to announce itself. I knew all this, because my buddy Terrence had mentioned her names when we drove past the neighborhood. The way you mention anyone you'll never actually meet. Except now I was standing inside her irrigation control box, water seeping into the trench I'd just dug, wondering why the pressure was reading wrong. That's been like that for 3 weeks. I turned. She was standing maybe 10 feet back, bare feet on the stone patio, holding a coffee mug in both hands like she needed the warmth, even though it was already 70 degrees and climbing. Dark hair pulled back, plain gray shirt, jeans. No assistant, no security, no one hovering behind her with a phone. Nobody mentioned that, I said. Nobody asked. She tilted her head toward the trench. Can you fix it or do I need to reschedule for the 4th time? I can fix it. She gave a short nod and went back inside. That was Margot. I spent the rest of the morning tracing the line. The break wasn't where I expected it. Usually with older systems, the failure point is near a valve, easy to find. This one had cracked in the middle of a straight run, underground, hidden under a section of decorative gravel. Somebody had laid wrong over a low spot where water collected. I dug the whole section out, replaced the pipe, reset the pressure, and ran a test by noon. She came back out when the sprinklers kicked on clean. Finally, she said, not to me specifically, just to the situation. You had a ground shift under the gravel there. Worth keeping an eye on the slope after heavy rain. She looked at the repaired section. What's your name, Miles? She looked back at the yard. You're thorough, Miles. It's the only way I know how to work. She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't go back inside either. She stood there for a moment with the mug and watched the water arc out over the grass in clean, even lines. There's a drip system in the terrace garden that's been losing pressure for 2 months, she said. And the exterior lights on the lower path flicker after dark. My usual contractor keeps saying he'll come. He hasn't. I looked at my watch. I had another job across town at 2. I can come back Thursday. Tomorrow would be better. I looked at her. I'll pay the same rate plus an hour for travel, she said. It wasn't a negotiation, it was just a statement of terms. So I came back the next day. The terrace garden was the kind of thing that took real money to build and real attention to keep. Raised beds and weathered cedar, drought-tolerant plants in between, stone pavers that cost more per square foot than I made in a day. The drip system ran underneath all of it, and whoever had installed it had done it quickly, which meant 2 of the emitter lines had crimped where they bent around corners. I worked through most of the morning replacing them. Margot was in and out. She had calls. I could hear her through the open French door sometimes, her voice even and precise, the kind of tone that sounded like she had already thought through everything you were about to say and was being patient about it. Around 11, she came out with a glass of water and set it near my tool bag without saying anything. I said, "Thank you," she said. "Don't let yourself get dehydrated in my yard. I can't deal with the liability." I laughed before I could stop myself. She almost smiled. That was the first time she stayed near me when she didn't need anything specific. She sat at the small iron table at the edge of the terrace while I finished the last run of drip line. The view from up there was something the canyon dropped away below, and beyond it you could see the Pacific going flat and silver toward the horizon. I had worked on properties up here before, but you never really got used to it. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Landscaping. Since I was about 17. Worked with my Uncle Summers, learned irrigation in my early 20s, started taking contracts about 3 years ago. You like it?" I thought about that for a second. Most people ask that expecting a certain answer. Yeah, I like working outside. I like when something broken runs clean again. She looked out at the canyon. That's a rare thing. Most people like the idea of a problem being solved but not the actual solving. "What do you like?" She turned toward me like the question surprised her. "Building things," she said after a moment. "Not the finished version. The part where it could still fail." I nodded. That made sense to me, in a way I didn't know how to explain right then. By the end of the week I was back again. The exterior path lights turned out to have a corroded connector in the junction box. Simple fix once I found it. While I was down on the lower path testing each fixture, one of the house staff, a woman named whoever Shiss who had the energy of someone who tracked everything without appearing to, came by and watched me work for about 30 seconds longer than necessary. "Mr. Ellison used to do the lights himself," she said. "Is that right? He passed 2 years ago." I kept my eyes on the fixture. "I'm sorry to hear that." She walked away without saying anything else. I filed that away and didn't bring it up. Margot found me on the lower path as the sun was starting to drop. The lights were working. All of them, clean and even down the stone steps. She stood at the top of the path and looked down. "That's the first time those have all been on at once in months." The connector was corroded all the way through. Surprised it lasted as long as it did. She came down a few of the steps and stopped. From where I was standing, the light came up from the path fixtures and caught the side of her face. She was looking at the canyon, not at me. "It was my husband's project," she said. "The whole lower path. He spent about 3 weekends on it. It's good work. He was good at things like that," she said it simply. No performance. Just a fact she had learned to carry. I picked up my tool bag. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound wrong, so I didn't say anything. Sometimes that's the better choice. She looked at me then, direct the way she always was. "Are you free next week?" That was the beginning of a pattern that built slowly enough that I didn't notice it happening. 3 days turned into 5. 5 turned into a standing arrangement where I came Tuesday and Thursday mornings, sometimes Friday if there was something pressing. The property always had something. Irrigation adjustments, a fence post that had shifted, a stone section of retaining wall where the mortar had cracked and needed repointing. Real work, all of it. But somewhere around the 3rd week I started noticing that the work had a way of appearing in whatever part of the property Margot was spending time in that day. I didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. We talked while I worked. That was how it started, in the practical way those things do. She'd come out with coffee or water, ask a question about the job. I'd answer, she'd stay. The conversation stretched. She asked about the mechanics of irrigation systems, with the same focused attention she probably gave to everything, like she was going to need to know this later. I asked about her work because I was genuinely curious, and she answered without performing humility or importance. She just told me how things worked. She was building something again, some kind of infrastructure software smaller than before, she said. She didn't need the money. She needed the problem. "You miss running a company?" I asked one afternoon. She considered that. "I miss the early part. When it's 3 people in a room and you don't know yet if it's going to work." "What about now?" "Now I have better coffee and nobody to disappoint but myself." She looked at me over her mug. "That's a lot better than it sounds." One evening I was finishing up on the terrace when I realized I had stayed an hour past when I meant to. The sun had gone the rest of the way down, and the path lights were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, which made the whole lower garden look different, warmer, like the property exhaled at dusk. Margot came out and stopped when she saw I was still there. "You're late," she said. "Lost track." She looked at the lights for a moment. "Are you hungry?" I almost said no. It was automatic. "Sure," I said instead. We ate on the terrace. She had made something simple, pasta with whatever was in the fridge, and she put it on the table without ceremony, like feeding someone was just a practical matter, not a statement. We talked for 2 hours. About her company. About my uncle who had taught me to read a grade before I knew what grade meant. About the way Malibu felt different from the rest of the city, like time moved at a different rate up in the hills. When I drove home that night, I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I knew what was happening. I also knew what it looked like from the outside. And those 2 things were already starting to be hard to hold at the same time. The house manager, whose name was Dwight, started doing what Marcus had done in similar situations I had heard about from other guys who worked on properties like this. Not unfriendly, just present. Coming around corners right as conversations were wrapping up, asking follow-up questions about the work schedule in a tone that sounded logistical but wasn't. One morning, he said, "Miss Ellison mentions you're getting familiar with the whole property." "That's the job," I said. "Right," he wrote something on his clipboard. "Right." Margot noticed. I knew because she started being more deliberate about where we talked and when. Brief exchanges near the main house when staff were moving through. Longer ones down at the terrace, or near the lower garden when the property was quieter. She didn't comment on it directly. She just adjusted. The way she seemed to adjust to everything, efficiently and without complaint. What surprised me was that when we were alone, she was less guarded than she'd been at the start. Like the effort of being careful in public required something she then let go of in private. One afternoon, she was sitting on the low terrace wall while I worked on the irrigation timer. She had her laptop open, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the canyon. "Do you ever think about leaving here?" I asked. "Malibu or wherever?" She closed the laptop. Sometimes, I think about whether I'm staying because I want to, or because leaving would require deciding where to go. That's a hard difference to know, yes. She looked at me. What about you? I'm still figuring out what I'm building. I set the timer cover back. I know how to fix things. Building from the start is different. It is, she said. And she said it like she meant something more than what I had said. A few weeks in, she asked me to drive her somewhere. She had a meeting across the canyon with a contractor about a guest property she owned, and her usual driver had a family thing. You don't have to, she said. I can take myself. I can drive. The roads through the canyon were narrow and switchbacked, and I kept my eyes where they needed to be. She sat in the passenger seat with a folder in her lap, and didn't seem bothered by the silence, which I had figured out by then was one of her actual qualities, not something she put on. On the way back she was looser. The meeting had gone well. She told me about it without being asked. The kind of talking you do when you're relieved and the other person is just there and safe. You're easy to be around, she said at one point. It wasn't a compliment exactly. More like an observation she was making in real time. You're not so bad yourself, I said. She laughed. A real one, not the polite version. That's a low bar. You cleared it though. When we got back, Dwight was near the main entrance. He watched us get out of the truck, nothing he could have said anything about. But the way he held his clipboard went very still. That night I got a text from the company I contracted through. A property in Santa Barbara needed a full irrigation overhaul, long-term project, good money. The site coordinator was asking if I was available to start in 3 weeks. I sat with my phone for a long time. The close calls started a week after that. Nothing dramatic at first. Margot and I were in the lower garden one evening, standing closer than we probably needed to be, looking at a section of stonework I had repointed. She said something and I turned toward her, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then Dwight's voice came from somewhere up the path and we both stepped apart and I picked up my trowel, and the moment was just gone, handled, put away. But the second one was worse. I was in the storage shed off the lower terrace, sorting through irrigation fittings when Margot came in and the door was half open. And we were talking about nothing really. Her leaning against the shelf, me at the work table, and I reached past her for something. And stopped because she hadn't moved back. We stayed in that half-inch for about 3 seconds. Then her phone rang, her attorney. She answered it and stepped outside and I stood there in the shed, feeling like I had almost stepped off a cliff I hadn't seen coming. The third one was the one that mattered. It was late on a Thursday. The house had been quieter than usual, most of the regular staff gone for the day. I had stayed to finish a section of edging that needed to be done before the weekend. Margot came down to the terrace, and for once there was no reason either of us needed to be there, except that we both were. We were sitting on the low terrace wall, close, the way you sit when you've stopped being careful about it. The city below was starting to light up. She had her shoulder against mine and neither of us had moved away. I know what this is, she said, not accusing. Just stating. Yeah, I said, and I know what it can't be. That one landed different. Not because she was wrong. Because she was right and had gotten there before I did. I looked at her. She was already looking at me. Up close, she looked more tired than usual and also more present than anyone I had been near in a long time. I'm not going to pretend it's nothing, she said quietly. Me neither. She leaned her head against my shoulder for about 30 seconds, that was all. Then she straightened up and picked up her mug and looked at the city. Tell me about Santa Barbara, she said. I told her everything I knew about the job. She listened and asked the kind of practical questions that made it clear. She already understood what I was actually asking underneath all of it. When I finished, she said, Is the money right? It's more than right. She nodded. Then you should go. I didn't say anything for a while. That's all? What would you prefer, I said. I didn't have a clean answer, which was its own kind of answer. She stood up from the wall and looked at the lower path, the lights running clean all the way down the slope. You fixed everything that needed fixing, she said. That's not nothing. I looked at her. Most people leave things broken, she said. You didn't. I nodded. It was the best I could do right then. There was a moment 3 days before I left where I thought it might still go a different direction. I was in the terrace garden doing a final inspection of the drip system, checking each emitter, and Margot came out and sat at the iron table and watched me work the way she had that first week. The morning light was coming in low over the canyon rim and the whole yard had that underwater quality it gets in early California summer. She had a book open but wasn't reading. I said, You're going to need someone to check the pressure regulator before winter. She said, I know, and the timer on the east zone resets if the power flickers. I left the manual in the shed, Miles. I stopped. I know, she said again softer. You've written everything down. It's all in order. I looked at her for a second. She looked back, her eyes were steadier than I felt. It mattered, she said. In case that's something you need to hear. I set down the emitter tool. Yeah, I said, it did. The morning I left, I loaded my truck in the dark. The property was quiet. I had already settled up with the contracting company and said what needed to be said to Dwight, who shook my hand like a man who had gotten the outcome he had been working toward and wasn't going to gloat about it. I had a last walkthrough, just for the work. The irrigation timers running, the path lights solid, the repointed wall cured and tight, the cedar beds in the terrace garden with the drip lines running right underneath them in clean, even loops. Margot wasn't outside. I hadn't expected her to be. I drove down the hill as the sun came up over the canyon. The automatic gate at the bottom opened when I approached and closed clean behind me. I had replaced the actuator on that gate my third week on the property. It had been grinding every time. It was quiet now. I pulled out onto the Pacific Coast Highway, and the ocean was right there, flat and enormous, and going on as far as you could see. I had about 2.5 hours to Santa Barbara if I didn't push it. I didn't look in the rear view. Not because it would have made me feel better, because some things are better carried forward than held behind you. Would you have taken the job or stayed? Tell me what you would have done.